The crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Prosperity, Colorado, as Grace Vaughn clutched her threadbare bag against her chest and ducked into the nearest alleyway. The year was 1878, and Grace had just arrived on the afternoon stagecoach with nothing but $10 to her name and a marriage contract that felt heavier than lead in her pocket. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs as she peered around the corner of the saloon. The shooting had nothing to do with her, just another drunken dispute between minors, but it served as a stark reminder of how far she was from the orderly streets of Boston. At 22, she had never imagined she would end up here, a mail-order bride to a man she had never met, in a town where lawlessness seemed to seep from the very soil. She unfolded the crumpled paper from her pocket, reading the name again. Harold Blackstone. A cattle baron, according to his letters, with a ranch outside of town and in need of a wife. His correspondence had been polite but businesslike, and the arrangement had seemed her only escape from destitution after her father's death left her with nothing but debts. Looking for something, miss? The voice startled her, gruff and low. Grace spun around to face a hulking man with a thick beard and eyes that seemed to strip her bare. I'm looking for Mr. Blackstone's representative. He was supposed to meet me at the station. The man's lips split into a grin, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Well now, ain't that convenient? I work for Mr. Blackstone. He stepped closer, the smell of whiskey and sweat overwhelming. I'm to take you to the ranch. Something in his expression made Grace's skin crawl. This couldn't be right. The letter had mentioned a formal welcome, perhaps even the Reverend being present. Do you have some identification, sir? Mr. Blackstone's letter specified, don't need no paper to prove who I am, he growled, grabbing her arm. Come on now, got a wagon round back. Grace tried to pull away, panic rising in her throat. Please, I'd rather wait for listen here, he hissed, tightening his grip. Blackstone paid good money for you, paid me to bring you to him, and that's what I'm doing. Paid for her, like cattle. The words sent ice through her veins. In her desperation to escape Boston, had she sold herself into something far worse? Let her go. The new voice was quiet but carried an unmistakable authority. The bearded man's head whipped around, his grip loosening slightly. A tall figure stood at the mouth of the alley, silhouetted against the dying sunlight. As he stepped forward, Grace could make out a lean frame, broad shoulders, and a Stetson pulled low over his eyes. This ain't your business, Decker, the bearded man spat. Making it my business, Jenkins. The newcomer moved closer, and Grace saw he wore no gun belt unusual in a town like this, but carried himself with the confidence of someone who didn't need one. Miss Vaughn is expected at the church, not to be dragged off by the likes of you. Jenkins' face contorted with anger. Blackstone'll hear about this. I'm counting on it. The man called Decker stepped forward, positioning himself between Grace and her assailant. Now move along before the sheriff gets curious about those horses that went missing from the Miller farm. With a final glare, Jenkins released Grace's arm and shouldered past them, muttering curses under his breath. Grace rubbed her arm, fighting back tears of relief and terror. How did you know my name? The man turned to her, and she got her first clear look at his face. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and eyes the color of the sky after a storm. He wasn't conventionally handsome. His nose looked to have been broken at least once, and a thin scar ran along his temple, but there was something compelling about his features. Reverend Miles asked me to fetch you when you didn't arrive at the church. He tipped his hat slightly. Adam Decker. I own the livery stable. The church, Grace frowned, but I was supposed to meet Mr. Blackstone's representative. Adam's expression darkened. That's right. Reverend Miles is the one who handles all of Blackstone's arrangements. He seemed to choose his words carefully. Jenkins works for Blackstone, but not in any official capacity. Oh, Grace wasn't sure what to make of this information. Thank you for your help, Mr. Decker. Call me Adam. He glanced at the small bag she clutched. Is that all you brought with you? She nodded, embarrassment heating her cheeks. I had to sell most of my belongings to pay for the journey. Something flickered in his eyes, pity perhaps, or understanding. Come on, I'll take you to the church. Reverend Miles will explain everything. As they walked through the dusty streets, Grace noticed how people nodded respectfully to Adam or called out friendly greetings. He responded to each with a quiet word or nod, but kept a careful distance between himself and Grace, as if aware of the impropriety of their situation. Have you known Mr. Blackstone long? She ventured, desperate to learn more about the man she was to marry. Adam's stride faltered slightly. Known of him longer than known him, he said after a pause. He keeps to himself mostly. Came here about 5 years back, bought up all the land he could. And he's a good man. Grace couldn't keep the tremor from her voice. Adam stopped walking and turned to face her. The setting sun cast long shadows across his face, making his expression unreadable. Miss Vaughn, I think it's best if we get to the church. Reverend Miles will answer your questions. The church was a simple white building at the edge of town, its steeple the tallest structure in Prosperity. As they approached, the door swung open to reveal an elderly man in clerical garb, his face creased with concern. Miss Vaughn, thank heavens. When you didn't arrive, I feared the worst. He ushered her inside, nodding gratefully to Adam. Thank you for finding her, my boy. Jenkins got to her first, Adam said quietly. The Reverend's face paled. Dear Lord, are you all right, my dear? Yes, thanks to Mr. Decker. Grace looked between the two men, confusion and fear churning in her stomach. Please, what's happening? I came to marry Mr. Blackstone, but I'm getting the sense there's something I don't understand. Reverend Miles exchanged a look with Adam, then sighed heavily. Please, sit down, Miss Vaughn. He gestured to a pew, and Grace sank onto the hard wood, her legs suddenly weak. Harold Blackstone is indeed a wealthy rancher, the Reverend began, his voice gentle, and he has brought several brides to Prosperity over the past few years. Several. Grace's mouth went dry. 4, to be exact. The Reverend's expression was grave. None have been seen in town after the first week. He claims they're simply occupied with running the household, but he trailed off. What he's not saying, Adam cut in, his voice tight with anger, is that Blackstone's brides end up with bruises when they do appear. And the last one, Mary Collins, hasn't been seen in months. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Are you suggesting we don't know, Reverend Miles said quickly, but we have concerns, serious concerns. I've tried to discourage these arrangements, but Mr. Blackstone is a powerful man in this county. Then why did you let me come? Grace's voice rose with panic. We didn't know you were coming until yesterday, Adam said. Blackstone usually has these arrangements made quietly. This time, he sent word to the Reverend about the ceremony, probably because the rumors have been spreading. Grace's mind raced. She had spent nearly everything she had to get here, had no family to return to, nowhere to go. What am I supposed to do now? Reverend Miles looked pained. That, my dear, is entirely your choice. We can't force you to refuse the marriage, nor can we force you to proceed with it. But I cannot in good conscience perform a ceremony without ensuring you understand the situation. Grace sat in stunned silence, the Reverend's words echoing in her mind. Her choice. When had anything in her life ever truly been her choice? Her father had arranged her education, chosen her friends, dictated her every move. After his death, poverty had made her choices for her. The idea that she could decide her own fate now was almost as terrifying as what she'd learned about Blackstone. If I don't marry him, she said finally, I have nowhere to go. No money to return east. Adam, who had been standing silently by the door, stepped forward. You could stay in prosperity. Mrs. Wilson at the boarding house often needs help, and she provides room and board. I've never worked as a maid, Grace admitted. Then find something else, Adam said simply. You look educated. Maybe you could teach. The possibility hung in the air like a fragile bubble. Could she really build a life here on her own terms? A sharp knock at the church door shattered the moment. Reverend Miles opened it to reveal a well-dressed man in his 50s, his silver hair slicked back beneath an expensive hat, his suit immaculate despite the dusty surroundings. Ah, Reverend, I understand my bride has arrived. His voice was cultured, pleasant even, but his eyes were cold as they swept over Grace. I must apologize for the confusion. It seems Jenkins misunderstood his instructions. Mr. Blackstone, the Reverend acknowledged stiffly. Yes, Miss Vaughn is here, but excellent. Blackstone stepped into the church uninvited, his gaze fixing on Grace. My dear, you're even lovelier than your photograph suggested. I trust your journey wasn't too taxing. Grace stood on shaky legs, acutely aware of how vulnerable she was. This man could offer her security, a home, a position as the wife of one of the wealthiest men in the territory. All she had to do was ignore the warnings, the rumors, the fear that made her heart race. Mr. Blackstone, she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. I need time to consider our arrangement. Blackstone's smile didn't waver, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Consider, my dear, you signed a contract. Your passage has been paid for. The Reverend is here. What is there to consider? The lady said she needs time. Adam moved to stand beside Grace, his presence reassuring despite the tension radiating from him. Blackstone's gaze shifted to Adam, and his smile turned cold. Mr. Decker, still interfering in matters that don't concern you, I see. Miss Vaughn's welfare concerns the whole town, Adam replied evenly. Blackstone laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Does it, or just you personally? He turned back to Grace. Perhaps Mr. Decker hasn't told you about his interest in my previous brides, particularly the last one. Grace glanced at Adam, whose jaw had tightened visibly. Miss Collins came to me for help, Adam said, his voice low. After you broke her arm. A tragic accident, Blackstone replied smoothly. The poor girl was prone to clumsiness, as I explained to the sheriff. That's enough, Reverend Miles interjected. Mr. Blackstone, Miss Vaughn has requested time, and as a gentleman you should respect that. Blackstone's face hardened. She has until tomorrow. After that, I expect her at the ranch, or I'll be forced to recoup my losses. He tipped his hat to Grace with mocking politeness. Until tomorrow, my dear. After he left, Grace sank back onto the pew, her legs unable to support her any longer. He's going to force me to go with him, isn't he? Not if I have anything to say about it, Adam growled. The Reverend sighed. Blackstone does have legal grounds to demand repayment for the passage, but we can figure something out. He patted Grace's hand kindly. For tonight, you should rest. Mrs. Wilson's boarding house is safe and respectable. Adam nodded. I'll escort you there. The walk to the boarding house was silent, the weight of her situation pressing down on Grace with each step. Mrs. Wilson, a plump, matronly woman with kind eyes, took one look at Grace's pale face and ushered her inside without asking questions, showing her to a small but clean room on the second floor. Dinner's at 6, she said, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts. Grace sat on the narrow bed, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back to fall. She had escaped one trap only to find herself in another. If she refused Blackstone, she would be destitute in a strange town. If she married him, she might suffer a fate worse than poverty. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She wiped her eyes hastily and opened it to find Adam standing in the hallway, looking uncomfortable. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, "but I thought you might want this." He held out a small pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. Grace stared at it in confusion. "I don't understand. It's enough to repay Blackstone for your passage with some left over." At her continued bewilderment, he added, "It's from me and some others in town, people who care about what happens." "Why would strangers help me?" she asked, unable to comprehend such generosity. Adam's expression softened slightly. "Because we've seen what happens to Blackstone's brides, and because not everyone in prosperity turns a blind eye to suffering." He held the pouch out again. "Please, take it." Hesitantly, Grace accepted the pouch, its weight both reassuring and troubling. "I can't possibly accept charity of this magnitude." "It's not charity," Adam said firmly. "It's a loan, if that makes you feel better. You can repay it once you're settled." Grace clutched the pouch, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." Adam shifted his weight, seeming almost nervous. "Just be careful. Blackstone won't take rejection well." After he left, Grace counted the money with trembling fingers. It was indeed enough to repay Blackstone and perhaps secure a few weeks of lodging while she found work. A way out. A choice. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the town settling into darkness, Grace thought about choices. All her life, she had done what was expected of her, followed the path laid out by others. Now, for the first time, she had the chance to choose her own way forward. The next morning, she dressed in her best and only good dress, pinned her dark hair neatly, and made her way downstairs. Mrs. Wilson was in the kitchen, kneading dough with strong, flour-covered hands. "Mrs. Wilson," Grace began hesitantly, "I understand you sometimes need help around the boarding house." The older woman looked up, her eyes shrewd but kind. "That I do. Why do you ask? I find myself in need of employment. I'm educated, I can read and write, do sums, keep accounts. And I'm willing to learn whatever else is required." Mrs. Wilson wiped her hands on her apron, studying Grace thoughtfully. "This have anything to do with that business with Blackstone?" News traveled fast in small towns. Grace nodded, not bothering to pretend. "Yes. I've decided not to proceed with the marriage." "Good for you," Mrs. Wilson said firmly. "Man's got a mean streak wider than the Mississippi." She pursed her lips, considering. "I can offer you room and board plus $2 a week to start. Work includes cleaning, helping with meals, and minding the front desk when I'm busy." It wasn't much, but it was honest work and a roof over her head. "I accept. Thank you." Mrs. Wilson nodded briskly. "You can start by taking this to the sheriff's office." She handed Grace a basket covered with a cloth. "Breakfast for Sheriff Taylor and his deputy. They'll be wanting to know you're staying in town, given the circumstances." The sheriff's office was a small building on the main street, its wooden sign weathered by sun and rain. Grace pushed open the door, the basket heavy in her hands, to find a middle-aged man with a salt and pepper mustache sitting behind a desk. A badge gleamed on his chest. "Mrs. Wilson sent breakfast," she announced, setting the basket on the desk. The sheriff looked up, his expression shifting from mild interest to recognition. "You must be Miss Vaughn. Heard you arrived yesterday." "News travels fast," Grace observed. "Small town." He uncovered the basket, revealing biscuits, bacon, and a jar of preserves. "Mighty kind of Emma." "Have a seat, Miss Vaughn. I expect we should talk." Grace sat opposite him, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. "I assume you know about my situation with Mr. Blackstone." "I do." The sheriff poured coffee from a pot on the stove, offering her a cup. "Also heard you might not be proceeding with the arrangement." "That's correct. I intend to repay Mr. Blackstone for my passage and find my own way here in prosperity." The sheriff nodded slowly. Wise decision, if you don't mind my saying so. Blackstone's not well liked in certain circles. He sipped his coffee. But he is powerful, owns half the county, including the bank and most of the water rights, makes him difficult to cross. Grace's stomach tightened. Are you saying he might cause trouble? I'm saying be careful. The sheriff leaned forward. I'll do what I can to keep the peace, but my authority only stretches so far. Blackstone has friends in the territorial government. It was a sobering reminder of how precarious her position was. Even with the money to repay him, Blackstone could make life difficult for her if he chose. I understand, she said quietly. Thank you for the warning. As Grace left the sheriff's office, she nearly collided with Adam, who was crossing the street toward the livery stable. Miss Vaughn, he greeted her, tipping his hat. How are you settling in? Well enough, she replied, managing a small smile. Mrs. Wilson has offered me employment, and I'll be repaying Mr. Blackstone this afternoon. Adam's expression darkened. I'd advise against going to see him alone. The Reverend has agreed to accompany me, she assured him. Though I admit I'm not looking forward to it. He seemed to hesitate, then said, I could come as well. Extra protection if needed. The offer touched her. That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to take you away from your work. My assistant can manage for an hour. His eyes met hers, serious and intent. Please, I'd feel better knowing you were safe. There was something in his gaze that made Grace's heart beat a little faster. Concern, certainly, but perhaps something more, something she hadn't expected to find in this dusty frontier town. Very well, she conceded. We're meeting at the church at 2 o'clock. I'll be there. He tipped his hat again and continued on his way, leaving Grace with a strange flutter in her chest that she didn't quite know how to interpret. The morning passed quickly, as Mrs. Wilson showed her the routines of the boarding house, which rooms needed cleaning, how the meals were prepared, where supplies were kept. Grace threw herself into the work, grateful for the distraction from her impending meeting with Blackstone. At precisely 2 o'clock, she arrived at the church to find Reverend Miles waiting on the steps. Adam joined them moments later, having changed into a clean shirt and vest, though he still wore the same worn boots and practical trousers. Mr. Blackstone's ranch is about 3 miles outside of town, the Reverend explained as they settled into his buggy. I sent word this morning that we would be calling. The landscape opened up as they left Prosperity behind, rolling hills covered in grass and scrub brush stretching toward distant mountains. Cattle dotted the hillsides, evidence of Blackstone's wealth and influence. The ranch house itself was impressive, a large 2-story structure with a wide porch and glass windows, surrounded by outbuildings and corrals. As they approached, Grace couldn't help but think about what her life might have been like as the mistress of such a place. Comfortable, certainly, but at what cost? A stable hand took the Reverend's horse, eyeing them warily as they climbed the steps to the porch. The door opened before they could knock, revealing Blackstone himself, impeccably dressed as before. Reverend, Miss Vaughn. His gaze hardened when it landed on Adam. Mr. Decker, what an unexpected pleasure, Mr. Blackstone, Grace began, determined to maintain her composure. I've come to inform you officially that I will not be proceeding with our arrangement. I have brought the money to repay you for my passage and any other expenses you may have incurred. Blackstone's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were cold. I see. And you felt it necessary to bring reinforcements for this announcement. Miss Vaughn is under the protection of the church, Reverend Miles said firmly, as is proper for a young woman in her situation. And Mr. Decker, is he representing the church as well? Blackstone's tone was mocking. I'm representing Prosperity, Adam replied evenly. The town has an interest in ensuring Miss Vaughn is treated fairly. Blackstone laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant. How noble. Please come in. We shouldn't discuss financial matters on the porch like common peddlers. He led them to a spacious parlor furnished with expensive imported pieces that seemed at odds with the frontier setting. Grace remained standing, unwilling to prolong the encounter by accepting his hospitality. "Here is the money for my passage and board," she said, holding out the pouch. $250 as specified in your letter." Blackstone made no move to take it. "My dear Miss Vaughn, our agreement was for marriage, not merely transportation. There are other considerations, preparations made, announcements sent, my reputation in the community." "Your reputation?" Adam couldn't contain his disbelief. After what happened to Mary Collins, Blackstone's face hardened. "You would do well to mind your tongue, Decker. Slander is a serious offense." "It's not slander if it's true," Adam shot back. "Gentlemen," Reverend Miles interjected, "let's remain civil." "Mr. Blackstone, the contract specifically states that the sum of $250 covers all expenses related to Miss Vaughn's journey and initial settlement. It makes no mention of additional compensation in the event the marriage does not proceed." Blackstone's jaw tightened, but he couldn't dispute the Reverend's words. "Very well," he said finally, taking the pouch from Grace. "But understand this. Miss Vaughn Prosperity is a small town in my territory. You may find it difficult to establish yourself here without my goodwill." It was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. Grace lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm prepared to take that chance, Mr. Blackstone. I believe in the decency of the people of Prosperity." A touching sentiment. Blackstone's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We shall see how long it sustains you." He gestured toward the door. "Now, if our business is concluded, I have matters to attend to." The tension in the buggy as they drove back to town was palpable. Grace sat between Adam and the Reverend, acutely aware of the former's barely contained anger. "He won't let this go," Adam said finally, breaking the silence. "He's not used to being refused." "What can he do?" Grace asked. "I've repaid the money. I've broken no laws." "Blackstone doesn't need to break laws to make life difficult," the Reverend said heavily. "He owns the bank, has influence with many of the merchants. He could make it hard for you to find work, to secure credit." "Mrs. Wilson has already employed me," Grace pointed out. "And Emma Wilson is one of the few people in town who doesn't care a whit for Blackstone's opinion," the Reverend agreed with a small smile. "You've chosen your ally well." Despite their attempts at reassurance, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a powerful enemy. As they returned to town, she wondered if she had merely exchanged one form of bondage for another. The next few days passed in a blur of new routines and faces. Grace learned the rhythms of the boarding house, met the regular boarders, mostly single men who worked in the mines or on nearby ranches, and began to find her footing in Prosperity. Mrs. Wilson proved to be a fair employer, strict but kind, and the work was not as demanding as Grace had feared. She saw Adam occasionally, usually in passing as he went about his business in town. Each time, he would tip his hat and inquire after her welfare, his manner respectful but warm. Grace found herself looking forward to these brief encounters more than she cared to admit. A week after her arrival, Grace was sweeping the boarding house porch when she noticed a commotion down the street. A crowd had gathered outside the general store, voices raised in anger or alarm. Curious, she set aside her broom and moved closer. "Raising prices without warning," a woman was saying, her face flushed with indignation. "Flour up by 50% overnight. How are families supposed to manage?" The store owner, a thin man with spectacles, looked miserable. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Baker, but my hands are tied. The bank raised my loan interest yesterday, and I can barely cover costs as it is." "The bank," someone muttered. "You mean Blackstone?" Grace felt a chill run down her spine. Was this connected to her refusal of Blackstone's proposal? She scanned the crowd and spotted Adam at its edge, his expression grim as he listened to the complaints. He caught her eye and moved toward her, stepping away from the gathering. "Miss Vaughn, I'm afraid this might be just the beginning. Mr. Blackstone is punishing the whole town because of me." The thought was horrifying, not directly. Adam glanced back at the crowd. He's smart enough to make it look like business, but the timing is suspect. First the general store, then word is the saloon's rent has doubled. "What can be done?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Adam shook his head. "Not much legally. Blackstone owns the buildings, sets the terms. The territorial governor is his friend from back east. Complaints won't get far." Grace felt sick. Had her decision to stay in prosperity doomed these people to economic hardship? "Perhaps I should leave," she said, the words tasting bitter. "Find another town, start over. And let him win." Adam's expression hardened. "That's what he wants, to drive you out, show everyone that crossing him has consequences." "But I can't be responsible for an entire town suffering," Grace protested. "You're not." Adam's voice softened slightly. "Blackstone is, and running won't solve anything. He'll just find another target, another way to control people." He was right, Grace realized. Blackstone's tactics were about power, not just her refusal. Still, the guilt weighed heavily on her as she returned to the boarding house. That evening, as she was serving dinner to the boarders, the door opened to admit a travel-worn woman in her 30s, her clothes dusty from the road, her face lined with exhaustion. "I need a room," she said, her voice carrying the hint of an accent Southern, perhaps, or Appalachian. Mrs. Wilson emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Of course, just you," the woman nodded. "Just me." She placed coins on the counter. "1 week to start." "I'm Emma Wilson. This is Grace Vaughn, my assistant." Mrs. Wilson gestured to Grace. "And you are Mary Collins." The name hit Grace like a physical blow. Mary Collins, Blackstone's last bride, the one who had reportedly disappeared. Mrs. Wilson's expression revealed nothing, but she exchanged a quick glance with Grace. "Welcome to prosperity, Miss Collins. Grace will show you to your room." As they climbed the stairs, Grace fought the urge to bombard the woman with questions. Mary Collins moved stiffly, as if in pain, and her left arm hung slightly differently than her right, an old injury, perhaps, not fully healed. "Here you are," Grace said, opening the door to a small but clean room. "Dinner is being served downstairs if you're hungry." Mary nodded her thanks, then paused, studying Grace's face. "You're new here?" "Yes, about a week now." "You're not from around here?" It wasn't a question. "No, I came from Boston." Something flickered in Mary's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. "For Blackstone." Grace couldn't hide her surprise. "How did you—" "I recognize the look," Mary said simply. "Hopeful but scared, ready to do what's necessary to survive." She set her small bag on the bed. "But you're here, not at the ranch, so either you haven't married him yet or—" "I didn't go through with it," Grace admitted. "I found employment here instead." Mary's face showed no emotion, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good," she said after a moment. "That's good." Grace couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. "Everyone thought you disappeared." A bitter smile crossed Mary's face. "I did. Ran as far as Denver. Worked in a laundry until I saved enough to come back." "Come back? Why would you return?" Mary's eyes hardened. "Unfinished business." She turned away, effectively ending the conversation. "I'll be down for dinner shortly." The next morning, Grace was sweeping the porch again when Adam approached, his expression urgent. "Mary Collins is back," he said without preamble. "I know." "She's staying at the boarding house." Adam's eyes widened. "Since when?" "She arrived last night." Grace leaned on her broom, lowering her voice. "She mentioned unfinished business. You know what that might mean." Adam ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration or concern. I helped her escape 6 months ago. Put her on a train to Denver with what money I could spare. She was in bad shape, broken arm, bruises everywhere. Said Blackstone would kill her if she stayed. Then why return? Grace asked, genuinely puzzled. I don't know, Adam admitted. But it can't be good. Blackstone will be furious if he learns she's back. As if summoned by his name, a black carriage appeared at the end of the street, drawn by matching horses. It pulled to a stop in front of the general store, and Harold Blackstone stepped down, immaculate as always in an expensive suit. Adam tensed beside her. What's he doing in town? They watched as Blackstone entered the store, emerging minutes later with the proprietor, who looked pale and agitated. The two men spoke briefly. Then Blackstone climbed back into his carriage, which continued down the street toward the boarding house. He's coming here, Grace realized with a jolt of alarm. Adam stepped in front of her protectively. Get inside. Warn Mary. Grace hurried into the boarding house, finding Mary in the kitchen helping Mrs. Wilson with breakfast preparations. Mr. Blackstone is coming, she said breathlessly. His carriage is headed this way. Mary's face drained of color, but she set down the bowl she was holding with surprising steadiness. I knew this would happen eventually, she said, more to herself than to Grace. Better sooner than later. You should hide, Grace urged. The back stairs, no. Mary's voice was firm. I'm done hiding. Mrs. Wilson frowned. Are you sure, girl, that man, I'm sure. Mary straightened her shoulders. I came back for a reason. Before Grace could ask what that reason might be, the front door opened and Blackstone's cultured voice filled the entry hall. Mrs. Wilson, a word, if you please. Mrs. Wilson wiped her hands on her apron, her expression hardening into determination. Stay here, she told Grace and Mary, then marched into the front room. Grace and Mary exchanged glances, then both moved to the doorway, listening. Mr. Blackstone, Mrs. Wilson's voice was cool. What brings you to my establishment business, Mrs. Wilson? I understand you've taken on new help recently, a Miss Vaughn. I have. She's a fine worker. I'm sure. Blackstone's tone suggested otherwise. However, I've come to inform you that your property taxes have been reassessed, effective immediately. Reassessed? Mrs. Wilson's voice rose. By whose authority? The county assessor's office, of course. Your property's value has appreciated significantly. The new tax bill will reflect that. It was extortion, plain and simple. Grace felt sick with guilt. Because of her, Mrs. Wilson was being targeted. That's interesting timing, Mrs. Wilson replied, her voice steady despite the threat, considering the property hasn't changed in 20 years. Markets fluctuate, Mrs. Wilson. Blackstone's voice was smooth as silk. Of course, arrangements could be made if you found yourself unable to meet the new obligations. My bank is always willing to discuss terms with valued community members. I'm sure it is, Mrs. Wilson said dryly. Is that all, Mr. Blackstone, for now? There was a pause, then Blackstone added, Oh, and if you happen to see Miss Vaughn, please inform her that my offer remains open, should she reconsider her hasty decision. I'll be sure to pass that along. The front door opened and closed, and moments later, Mrs. Wilson returned to the kitchen, her face flushed with anger. Vulture, she muttered, thinks he can squeeze me out. This is because of me, Grace said miserably. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Wilson. Perhaps I should. Don't you dare finish that thought, Mrs. Wilson interrupted. I've been standing up to men like Blackstone my whole life. I'm not about to stop now. Mary, who had been silent during the exchange, suddenly moved toward the window. He's gone, she said, watching Blackstone's carriage disappear down the street. But he'll be back, or send someone. What did you mean you came back for a reason? Grace asked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. Mary turned from the window, her expression resolute. I came back for evidence, proof of what Blackstone did to me and the others. There's a ledger in his study records of his dealings, including payments to men like Jenkins to handle problems. I saw it once, before he caught me, and she trailed off, her hand unconsciously moving to her left arm. Evidence for what purpose? Mrs. Wilson asked. To take to the territorial governor. With proof of Blackstone's crimes, even his friends couldn't protect him. It was a bold plan, but incredibly dangerous. How were you planning to get this ledger? Grace asked. I hadn't figured that part out yet, Mary admitted. I can't go back to the ranch, he'd recognize me instantly. An idea began to form in Grace's mind, risky but potentially effective. What if, she said slowly, I told Blackstone I'd reconsidered his offer? Absolutely not, Adam's voice came from the doorway. He had entered quietly during their conversation, his expression thunderous. It's too dangerous. Hear me out, Grace insisted. If I tell him I've changed my mind, he might invite me to the ranch. I could find the ledger while I'm there. He'd never leave you alone long enough, Adam argued. And if he caught you searching his study, he wouldn't harm me before the wedding, Grace reasoned. It would raise too many questions, especially with the Reverend and others knowing about the arrangement. Mary was nodding slowly. It could work. The ledger is in the bottom drawer of his desk, locked, but the key is kept in a box on the mantelpiece. Mrs. Wilson looked troubled. It's a terrible risk, Grace. That man is dangerous. Which is exactly why he needs to be stopped, Grace replied firmly. Before he hurts anyone else, or ruins the town completely. Adam's face was a mask of concern and anger. There has to be another way. Is there? Grace challenged. Can the sheriff arrest him without evidence? Can anyone stand against him while he controls the town's economy? The silence that followed was answer enough. I'll need a reason to search his study, Grace continued, thinking aloud. A distraction of some kind. The Reverend, Mrs. Wilson suggested. If he accompanied you to discuss wedding arrangements, he could keep Blackstone occupied while you slip away. It was a plan fraught with risk, but the more they discussed it, the more feasible it seemed. By mid-afternoon, the details were settled. Grace would send word to Blackstone that she had reconsidered his offer, requesting a meeting to discuss terms. The Reverend, informed of the true purpose, would accompany her as propriety demanded, creating the opportunity Grace needed. As the others dispersed to make preparations, Adam remained behind, his expression troubled. I don't like this, he said bluntly. Blackstone is unpredictable. If he suspects anything, he won't, Grace assured him with more confidence than she felt. He's arrogant. He'll believe I've come to my senses, realize the futility of resisting him. Adam moved closer, his voice dropping. Grace, you don't have to do this. We could find another way. It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in his tone made her heart beat faster. I want to, she said softly. Not just for Mary or for myself, but for everyone in Prosperity, for you. His eyes searched hers, intense and filled with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Be careful, he said finally. Promise me, I promise. The word hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Adam reached out, his fingers briefly touching hers in a gesture too deliberate to be accidental, then turned and left, his shoulders set with determination. Grace watched him go, a strange mixture of fear and anticipation coursing through her. Tomorrow, she would face Blackstone on his own territory, armed with nothing but her wits and courage. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a curious sense of purpose, as if her entire journey had been leading to this moment. As night fell over Prosperity, Grace sat by her window, watching the stars emerge in the vast western sky. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt as if she were exactly where she was meant to be. Not as a mail-order bride, not as a desperate woman fleeing poverty, but as someone who had found her own strength, making choices that mattered. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would face it on her own terms. And that, she realized, was worth any risk. The morning dawned clear and cool, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. Grace dressed with particular care, choosing her most modest and respectable attire, a dove-gray dress with a high collar and simple trim. Her hair she arranged in a neat chignon, projecting an image of practical respectability. Reverend Miles arrived at the boarding house precisely at 10, his aging buggy freshly cleaned for the occasion. "Are you certain about this, my dear?" he asked as he helped Grace into the seat beside him. "I am," she replied firmly. "It's the only way." They had barely started down the street when Adam appeared, leading a saddled horse. "I'll be riding a short distance behind," he announced, his tone brooking no argument. "Close enough to help if needed, far enough not to be seen." Grace opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. His presence, even at a distance, was reassuring. "Thank you," she said simply. The journey to Blackstone's ranch seemed shorter this time, the familiar landscape passing in a blur as Grace rehearsed what she would say. The note she had sent the previous day had been brief and suitably humble, expressing regret for her hasty decision and requesting an opportunity to discuss the arrangement anew. Blackstone's reply had come within hours, inviting her to the ranch at her earliest convenience. As they approached the imposing house, Grace's heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain outwardly calm. Blackstone himself met them at the door, his expression pleasant but triumphant. "Miss Vaughn, Reverend, how delightful to see you both." He ushered them into the parlor where they had met before. "I must say, I was pleased to receive your note, Miss Vaughn. I had hoped you would reconsider once you understood the realities of frontier life." Grace lowered her eyes demurely, playing the part of a chastened woman. "You were right, Mr. Blackstone. I was naive to think I could establish myself here without protection." Blackstone smiled, clearly satisfied by her apparent submission. "Such wisdom in one so young, I'm impressed." He turned to the Reverend. "I assume you're here to discuss the ceremony." "Indeed," Reverend Miles replied, his acting skills surprisingly convincing. "Miss Vaughn has requested my guidance in these matters, as is proper for a young woman without family present, of course." Blackstone gestured to the comfortable chairs. "Please sit. I'll have refreshments brought." He rang a small bell, and a timid-looking maid appeared almost instantly. "Tea and cakes for our guests," he instructed. As they settled into conversation about wedding arrangements, Grace carefully observed her surroundings, noting the layout of the house, the position of doors. She needed to locate Blackstone's study without arousing suspicion. Her opportunity came when the maid returned with the tea tray, setting it on a small table between them. As Blackstone poured, Grace deliberately spilled a few drops on her skirt. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she exclaimed, rising quickly. "If you'll excuse me, I should attend to this before it stains." "Of course, my dear," Blackstone replied smoothly. "Maggie will show you to the powder room." The maid bobbed a curtsy and led Grace from the parlor, through the entry hall and down a corridor. "Here you are, miss," she said, opening a door to a small but well-appointed powder room. "Thank you, Maggie," Grace said warmly. "I can find my way back." Once alone, Grace dabbed at the small spot with a dampened towel, her mind racing. She needed to locate the study, and quickly. The maid had mentioned that Blackstone spent most evenings in his office at the back of the house. That was as good a direction as any to start. Leaving the powder room, Grace moved quietly down the corridor, away from the parlor. The house was silent except for the distant murmur of Blackstone and the Reverend's voices. She passed a dining room, a music room with a piano that looked rarely used, and finally reached a closed door at the end of the hall. Heart pounding, she turned the knob carefully and peered inside. A large desk dominated the room, flanked by bookshelves and a stone fireplace. This had to be Blackstone's study. Grace slipped inside, closing the door silently behind her. The desk was ornate and imposing, its surface neat and organized. Moving quickly, she tried the bottom drawer locked, as Mary had said. She glanced at the mantelpiece, spotting a small decorative box. Inside, she found a ring of keys. The third key fit the drawer, which slid open to reveal several leather-bound ledgers. Grace pulled them out, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers. Dates, names, amounts all recorded in Blackstone's precise handwriting. She found entries for J. Jenkins Special Services and, chillingly, M. Collins Discipline. There were others too, women's names followed by notations like disposed of or relocated. A wave of nausea washed over her. This wasn't just evidence of financial misdeeds, it was a record of violence, perhaps even murder. Grace quickly replaced the ledgers, keeping one that seemed to contain the most damning information, and locked the drawer. She was halfway to the door when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Panic seized her as she looked frantically for a hiding place. The footsteps paused outside the door, and then a key turned in the lock. Grace barely had time to slip behind the heavy velvet curtains before the door opened, and Blackstone entered, followed by the Reverend. As I was saying, Reverend, I believe a small ceremony would be most appropriate, Blackstone was saying. Perhaps here at the ranch with just a few select guests. Miss Vaughn may have her own preferences, the Reverend replied, his voice strained. He must be worried about Grace's absence from the parlor. Miss Vaughn will adapt to my wishes, Blackstone said dismissively. She's a practical girl, as she's demonstrated by returning to our arrangement. Grace held her breath, pressed against the window behind the curtain, the ledger clutched to her chest. If Blackstone discovered her now. I should check on Miss Vaughn, the Reverend suggested. She's been gone some time. Maggie will see to her, Blackstone replied, moving to his desk. While we're here, I might as well show you the settlement I've prepared for her. It's quite generous, provided she fulfills her obligations. The way he said obligations made Grace's skin crawl. As Blackstone unlocked a different drawer, she saw her chance. If she could slip out while his back was turned. Taking a deep breath, she stepped silently from behind the curtain, keeping her eyes fixed on the door. The Reverend saw her immediately, his eyes widening, but he quickly masked his reaction, continuing his conversation with Blackstone as if nothing were amiss. I'm sure Miss Vaughn will appreciate your generosity, he said, deliberately raising his voice slightly. She's a young woman of fine character. Grace reached the door, her hand closing around the knob. Just as she began to turn it, Blackstone spoke again. Character is malleable, Reverend, given the right incentives. Something in his tone made Grace freeze. Had he seen her? Was he toying with her? But when she glanced back, Blackstone was still rifling through his desk drawer, his back to her. The Reverend caught her eye and gave a tiny nod. Taking a silent breath, Grace slipped through the door and into the hallway, the ledger hidden in the folds of her skirt. Her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard throughout the house, Grace hurried back toward the parlor. She had just rounded the corner when she collided with Maggie, who was carrying a fresh pot of tea. Oh, the maid stumbled, the teapot wobbling dangerously on its tray. Miss, I was looking for you. I'm so sorry, Grace apologized, steadying the tray with one hand while keeping the ledger hidden with the other. I got turned around trying to find my way back. Maggie frowned slightly. But you've come from the west wing. The powder room is in the east. Before Grace could formulate a response, a door opened down the hall and Blackstone's voice rang out. Maggie, is that Miss Vaughn? Yes, sir, the maid called back. She got lost on her way from the powder room. Blackstone appeared in the hallway, the Reverend behind him, his expression concerned. Did you, my dear? How unfortunate. This house can be quite confusing for newcomers." His tone was pleasant, but his eyes were cold, assessing. Did he suspect? Had he noticed the missing ledger already? "I'm afraid I have a poor sense of direction," Grace said with a self-deprecating smile. "A fault my father often scolded me for." "A husband might be more forgiving," Blackstone replied, offering his arm. "Shall we return to the parlor?" The Reverend and I were just discussing potential dates for the ceremony. Grace took his arm reluctantly, acutely aware of the ledger pressed against her side. If she could just maintain the charade a little longer until they could leave. "Actually," the Reverend interjected, "I believe we've covered the essentials for today, and I promised Mrs. Wilson I would have Miss Vaughn back before dusk. She has duties at the boarding house." "Duties?" Blackstone's eyebrows rose. "Surely those can be dispensed with now that our arrangement is being renewed." "Until the ceremony, I feel it's important to honor my commitments," Grace said quickly. "Mrs. Wilson has been very kind to me." Blackstone studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Very well," he said finally. "Reverend, you may escort Miss Vaughn back to town. I look forward to our next meeting, my dear." The way he said "my dear" sent a chill down Grace's spine, but she maintained her composure, allowing the Reverend to lead her out to the waiting buggy. Only when they were well down the drive did she finally release the breath she'd been holding, pulling the ledger from her skirt. "You found it," the Reverend said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank the Lord." "It's worse than we thought," Grace said grimly. "There are entries about other women, descriptions of terrible things." The Reverend's hands tightened on the reins. "We'll take it straight to the sheriff." With this evidence, a gunshot cracked through the air, startling the horse, which reared in alarm. The Reverend struggled to control the animal as a second shot rang out, this one splintering the wood of the buggy's seat between them. "He knows," Grace gasped, clutching the ledger to her chest as the Reverend finally brought the horse under control. "He must have checked his desk after we left." "Hold on," the Reverend urged, slapping the reins against the horse's back. The buggy lurched forward, picking up speed as they raced down the road toward town. More shots followed, but they were already out of accurate range. As they crested a small rise, Grace looked back to see two riders emerging from the ranch, giving chase. "They're coming after us," she cried. The Reverend glanced back, his face grim. "This old horse can't outrun them for long. We need help." As if in answer to his words, a rider appeared from a stand of trees to their right at him, his horse at full gallop. He pulled alongside the buggy, his expression fierce. "Blackstone's men," he shouted over the thunder of hooves. "Yes," Grace called back. "We have the ledger, but they're gaining on us." Adam's face hardened with determination. "Get to town. I'll slow them down." Before Grace could protest, he wheeled his horse around and charged back toward their pursuers, drawing his revolver as he rode. "Adam!" she cried, terror gripping her heart. "He knows what he's doing," the Reverend assured her, though his voice betrayed his own concern. "We need to get that ledger to the sheriff." Gunfire erupted behind them, the sounds growing distant as the buggy continued its headlong rush toward Prosperity. Grace clutched the seat with white-knuckled hands, torn between fear for her own safety and agonizing worry for Adam. The town came into view, its buildings a welcome sight after the terrifying chase. People appeared in doorways and windows as the buggy careened down the main street, finally coming to a halt in front of the sheriff's office. Sheriff Taylor emerged, alerted by the commotion. "Reverend, what in tarnation? Blackstone," the Reverend gasped, helping Grace down from the buggy. "His men are after us. Adam Decker is holding them off." The sheriff's expression shifted from confusion to grim understanding. "Inside, quick." He ushered them into his office, calling to his deputy, "Peterson, get some men together. Sounds like trouble coming." Once inside, Grace thrust the ledger into the sheriff's hands. "Evidence," she said breathlessly, "of everything. The women, the bribes, all of it." The sheriff flipped through the pages, his face darkening with each entry. "This is enough to hang him," he muttered. "But Blackstone won't go down easy." As if to confirm his words, the sound of galloping horses filled the street outside. Grace moved to the window, her heart in her throat, praying to see Adam among the riders. 3 men thundered into town, Jenkins and 2 others she didn't recognize. Of Adam, there was no sign. "Stay here," the sheriff ordered, checking his revolver before stepping outside to confront the newcomers. Grace pressed herself against the window, straining to hear the exchange. Jenkins and his companions had reined in their horses, facing the sheriff and the growing number of townspeople who had gathered. "We've come for the woman and the book she stole," Jenkins shouted, his voice carrying clearly. "The only stealing I know about is Blackstone extorting this town," the sheriff replied steadily. "And as for Miss Vaughn, she's under my protection now." Jenkins sneered. "You and what army, Taylor? Blackstone owns this county." "Not anymore," came a new voice, strong and clear. Grace's heart leaped as Adam rode into view, dusty but apparently unharmed. He dismounted, moving to stand beside the sheriff. "Not with what's in that ledger." More townspeople were arriving now, many carrying rifles or shotguns. They formed a line behind the sheriff and Adam, a clear message to Blackstone's men. Jenkins looked around, suddenly aware of how outnumbered they were. "This ain't over," he growled, wheeling his horse around. "Blackstone will burn this town to the ground before he lets you take him." "Let him try," the sheriff replied calmly. "Go back and tell him we're coming for him, with warrants." As Jenkins and his men rode off, Grace rushed outside, her relief at seeing Adam overwhelming her usual restraint. Before she could think better of it, she threw her arms around him, heedless of the watching crowd. "You're all right," she breathed, feeling his arms tentatively encircle her. "Takes more than Blackstone's thugs to stop me," he replied softly, then added with a hint of humor, "though it was a near thing with that last shot." Grace pulled back, suddenly embarrassed by her display. "I was worried," she admitted, smoothing her skirt nervously. Adam's eyes softened. "Worth it to see that ledger in the sheriff's hands." He glanced toward the office where the sheriff was examining the evidence with the reverend. "Is it enough?" "More than enough," Grace confirmed. "But Jenkins is right, Blackstone won't surrender easily." Adam's expression hardened. "Then we'd better prepare." The next hours passed in a flurry of activity. The sheriff sent riders to the nearest federal marshal's office with copies of the most damning entries from the ledger. The townspeople, galvanized by the prospect of freedom from Blackstone's influence, organized themselves into watches, guarding the approaches to town. By nightfall, Prosperity had transformed from a quiet frontier settlement to an armed camp. Grace, along with Mrs. Wilson and Mary Collins, prepared food for the men standing watch, the boarding house becoming a makeshift headquarters. "You think he'll really attack the town?" Grace asked Mary as they worked side by side in the kitchen. Mary's expression was grim. "He'll do whatever it takes to get that ledger back. It's not just about you anymore, it's about his survival." The night passed tensely but without incident. As dawn broke, Adam appeared at the boarding house, looking exhausted but alert. "Any news?" Grace asked, handing him a cup of coffee. "The marshal's men should arrive by noon," he reported, accepting the cup gratefully. "And no sign of Blackstone or his men." "That's good, isn't it?" Adam's face remained troubled. "Maybe, or maybe he's planning something worse than a direct attack." His words proved prophetic when, an hour later, the stagecoach arrived with disturbing news. The driver reported seeing smoke rising from several outlying farms' properties whose owners had defied Blackstone in the past. "He's burning them out," the sheriff said grimly when Adam brought the news. "Trying to draw us out, divide our forces. We can't just let people's homes burn," Grace protested. "We won't," Adam assured her, "but we need to be smart about this. Blackstone wants us scattered, vulnerable." The sheriff nodded agreement. "We'll send small groups to help the farmers, but keep most of our strength here, protecting the town and the evidence." As the day wore on, tension mounted. The marshal's men were delayed by a washed-out bridge, and more reports came in of properties being targeted. Blackstone was systematically attacking everyone who had opposed him, spreading fear throughout the county. By mid-afternoon, smoke was visible from the edge of town, a nearby ranch ablaze. Adam organized a bucket brigade to prevent the fire from spreading to the town itself, while the sheriff maintained a vigilant watch for Blackstone's men. Grace was helping fill buckets when a commotion at the other end of town caught everyone's attention. Horses and wagons were approaching not Blackstone's men, but families fleeing from outlying homesteads, seeking refuge in prosperity. "He's driving everyone in," Adam realized as he watched the refugees arrive, "concentrating us all in one place." The implication was clear. Blackstone intended to destroy prosperity itself, with everyone who had defied him trapped inside. As darkness fell for the second night, the town braced for attack. Women and children were gathered in the sturdiest buildings, the church and the bank, while men took up positions throughout the streets. Grace, despite protests from Adam and the Reverend, insisted on remaining at the boarding house, which had become a makeshift hospital for those injured in the fires. "I'm not hiding when I can be useful," she told Adam firmly. "This started because of me. I need to see it through." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Just promise me you'll stay inside, away from windows." "I promise," she replied, touched by his concern. The attack, when it came, was not the frontal assault they had expected. Shortly after midnight, while most of the town dozed fitfully at their posts, flames erupted simultaneously at several points around the perimeter of Prosperity. Blackstone had sent men to set fires under cover of darkness, attempting to trap the townspeople in a ring of flames. The alarm was raised immediately, and the bucket brigades reformed with desperate energy. Grace worked alongside Mrs. Wilson and the other women, passing buckets from hand to hand, fighting to contain the spreading fires. Through the smoke and chaos, she caught glimpses of Adam directing the firefighting efforts, his face blackened with soot, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. The townspeople rallied around him, following his lead without question. As dawn approached, they had managed to control most of the fires, saving the majority of the buildings. Exhausted but triumphant, Grace was returning to the boarding house when a movement in the alley beside the general store caught her eye. A figure slipped through the shadows, Harold Blackstone himself, moving furtively toward the sheriff's office where the ledger was kept. Without thinking, Grace followed, staying close to the buildings to avoid being seen. Blackstone paused at the back door of the sheriff's office, producing a key likely stolen or copied during one of his many dealings with the local government. As he unlocked the door, Grace realized his intent. With the town distracted by the fires, he planned to steal back the damning evidence. She had to warn someone. Looking around frantically, she spotted Adam across the street, helping an elderly woman whose home had been damaged. "Adam," she called, her voice rising above the general commotion. Blackstone's head whipped around at her cry, his eyes finding her in the pre-dawn light. For a moment they stared at each other, mutual recognition and hatred passing between them. Then, with surprising speed for a man his age, Blackstone drew a pistol from his coat. "You," he hissed, advancing toward her. "You ruined everything." Grace backed away but found herself trapped against the wall of the general store. Across the street, Adam had heard her call and was now running toward them, shouting for Blackstone to stop. "It's over, Blackstone," Grace said, trying to keep her voice steady despite her fear. "The marshal is coming. Everyone knows what you've done." "Then I have nothing left to lose," Blackstone replied, raising his pistol. Time seemed to slow. Grace saw Adam racing toward them, saw the murderous intent in Blackstone's eyes, saw her own death reflected in the barrel of his gun. She closed her eyes, bracing for the impact. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space of the alley. Grace flinched, but felt no pain. Opening her eyes, she saw Blackstone staggering backward, a look of shock on his face as he clutched his chest. Behind him stood Mary Collins, a smoking revolver in her hand. "That's for every woman you hurt," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hand. "For every life you destroyed." Blackstone collapsed to his knees, the pistol falling from his grasp. "You." He gasped, recognition dawning in his eyes. "You're dead." "No," Mary replied simply. "I'm free." As Blackstone slumped to the ground, Adam reached Grace's side, pulling her against him protectively. The sheriff arrived moments later, taking in the scene with a grim expression. "He was going to kill her," Mary explained, handing the revolver to the sheriff. "I couldn't let that happen, not to another innocent woman." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Self-defense protecting Miss Vaughn, that's what my report will say." By mid-morning, the federal marshal had arrived with his deputies, bringing news that the territorial governor had issued warrants for Blackstone, and his men based on the evidence in the ledger. Jenkins and the others were rounded up quickly, having lost their will to fight once news of Blackstone's death spread. As the town began the process of rebuilding, assessing the damage from the fires, and coming to terms with the dramatic events, Grace found herself standing on the porch of the boarding house, watching the activity in the street below. Despite the destruction, there was a sense of relief, of unburdening that permeated Prosperity. Adam joined her, his face still smudged with soot, his eyes tired but peaceful. "It's over," he said simply, standing beside her at the railing. "Thanks to Mary," Grace replied. "I can't believe she followed him all the way from Denver, waiting for her chance." "She needed closure," Adam said. "We all did." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the marshal's men loaded Jenkins and the others into a prison wagon. "What will you do now?" Adam asked finally, his voice carefully neutral. Grace considered the question. For the first time in her life, the future was entirely her own to shape. No father dictating her path, no poverty forcing desperate choices, no Blackstone threatening her freedom. "Stay," she said simply. "Prosperity feels like home now. Mrs. Wilson has offered me a partnership in the boarding house, and I've been thinking about starting a small school as well." Adam's expression lightened. "The town could use a good school." "And you?" Grace asked, turning to face him fully. "What will you do?" A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Stay," he echoed. "The livery needs expanding now that the stage line is increasing service, and—" He hesitated, then continued more softly, "I have reasons to stay beyond business." Grace felt her heart quicken at the look in his eyes. "Oh. What reasons might those be, Mr. Decker?" He moved closer, his hand finding hers on the railing. "Well, Miss Vaughn, I find myself quite attached to this town and certain of its inhabitants." "I see," Grace replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anyone in particular?" Adam's other hand came up to gently touch her cheek. "Yes," he said simply. "Someone very particular indeed." As his lips met hers in a gentle, questioning kiss, Grace felt the last pieces of her new life falling into place. She had come to Prosperity expecting to surrender her freedom, to become another man's possession. Instead, she had found her own strength, her own voice, and a man who saw her as an equal, not a prize. When they finally parted, Adam rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the day you arrived," he admitted. Grace smiled, a new confidence in her eyes. And I've wanted you to, she confessed, though I wasn't brave enough to admit it, even to myself. You're the bravest person I know, Adam said with conviction. You stood up to Blackstone, risked everything to help Mary and the town. We all did, Grace corrected him. That's what community means, isn't it? Standing together against those who would harm us. Adam nodded, taking both her hands in his. Grace, I know it's soon and I'm not a wealthy man like Blackstone, but don't, she interrupted gently. Don't compare yourself to him. You're everything he wasn't: kind, honest, brave. She squeezed his hands. And I don't need wealth, I just need this, us, a chance to build something real. Then that's what we'll do, Adam promised. Together. As the sun rose higher over Prosperity, Grace Vaughn stood beside the man she had come to love, looking out at the town that had become her home. She had arrived as a mail-order bride, expecting to surrender her choices to a stranger's will. Instead, she had found the courage to choose her own path, to fight for her own freedom, and in doing so had helped liberate an entire community. And when Adam had said those words to her that first night, not here. Here you choose, he had given her the greatest gift of all, the recognition of her own agency, her own worth. It was a gift she would treasure for all the days of their life together, in this town they had helped save, among people who had become family. In the Wild West, where law was often secondary to power, Grace had learned that true strength came not from domination, but from compassion, courage, and community. And in that knowledge, she had found not just freedom, but love, a love built on respect, on equality, on the simple, revolutionary idea that she had the right to choose.